and welcome back. Quite a few years ago, I ran into this amazing system, which you may be familiar with, called the Enneagram. Originally from an oral tradition, it was brought into kind of written form, and one of the main pioneers in the Enneagram, which is this incredibly sophisticated map of personality, of conditioning, and ultimately pointing toward freedom. One of the early pioneers was Helen Palmer. And number one, I highly recommend, if you're interested in learning more about the personality conditioning and how to decondition yourself, and also about the incredible nuance of how personalities relate to each other and getting more insight into the nature of again, relationship, but also structures of consciousness in a very accessible way. Highly recommend you check it out. Helen Palmer was one of the early pioneers who really brought all this forward. And there's just a little story about her that I find fascinating, and it really is sort of the crux of what I'd like to share with you, if you want to keep listening. She was highly intuitive, and in fact, she was a practicing intuitive. And she was really renowned for this gift. She was trained in psychology. She went through some powerful dark night of the soul stuff, and there's sort of like this awakening of this amazing intuitive ability. Really, really well, really quite renowned. But here's the thing I want to point out and explore with you if this interests you. This gift of intuition, like her psychic abilities, if you will, that really brought her to the foreground of people seeing her as gifted. Where did that gift of intuition come from? Well, from my understanding, that intuitive gift, in part, came from growing up in an unstable household. A household where there was alcoholism, a household where things were unpredictable. The hypervigilance of that little person, that little girl. And many people talk about this, how when they grow up in really unstable households, you learn how the car door is slammed, whether you or someone's going to be yelled at or hit. That hypervigilant anxiety has the potential to become a superpower. And it's such a paradox. And it's what I'd like to talk about. Our deepest wounds can become our most sacred gifts. How does that happen? So part one, I'd like to talk about the inevitable wounding that you experience in your life, if you haven't noticed already. Part two, the possible unveiling of the gift that those wounds offer you. Part three, the concept of the wounded healer, what it means to be a wounded healer. And part four, if we have time, how we might start to reframe the experience of pain. So the inevitable wounding in your life. So what is life? Well, here's one perspective. Here's one definition. Life is a sexually transmitted disease that is always fatal. Whew. How about that for a particular outlook on life? A sexually transmitted disease that is always fatal. Well, kind of true. But when you look at the Four Noble Truths, like the four foundations of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist psychology, what is the first observation? The first observation is that life contains inevitable, unavoidable stress and suffering. Life contains inevitable and unavoidable stress and suffering. So let me ask you, what are your top three stressors right now? What are the top three things that are creating some unease in your life? Just take a moment Sense if you can name them, just the headlines, 1, 2, and 3. Might be helpful to close your eyes if you're not driving. Now, if you have a sense of these top 3 stressors, just take a moment. What felt sense forms when you think about them? That is to say, how do these stressors in your life, how do they live in your nervous system? Can you locate what it feels like inside? Quite often there's a clench, there's a tightening, there's a hardening, there's stagnation. Our issues are in our tissues. So here's the interesting thing that I find, that life contains inevitable, unavoidable stress and suffering, but the corollary is when you feel stress and suffering, it does not necessarily mean that something is wrong. When you feel stress and suffering, it does not necessarily mean that something is wrong. Okay. In Pali, the language of the Buddha, stress and suffering is described as dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, and it's a very nuanced word, so it's hard to describe it in just one word, but you can think of it as stress, as dissatisfaction, that inherent dissatisfaction, a sense of unsteadiness. Quite often it's referred to as suffering, but think of it as dissatisfaction, unsteadiness, and suffering. Here's what the Buddha said, and this is just a translation. Now, what, friends, is the noble truth of stress? Birth is stressful, aging is stressful, death is stressful, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are stressful. Association with the unbeloved is stressful. Separation from the loved is stressful. Not getting what is wanted is stressful. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. 5 clinging aggregates. Okay, what are the 5 clinging aggregates? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say you're in a challenging relationship that's important to you, and both of you are really upset. So here's the issue, and inevitably you think about it and you mull over it, and you notice that when you think about this issue, you feel kind of sick inside. Like maybe there's a sense of dread. Maybe there's like that twisted feeling in your guts, like something's really wrong. So the more you sit with it, the more you realize that there's so many components here, that there's actually some anger, there's some hopelessness. Maybe there's a feeling of sadness. Maybe there's a feeling of like anticipatory loneliness if it's over. Then your mind starts to imagine all kinds of possibilities. It goes into a story of how it's over, this friendship has ended. And then it goes down another route. Maybe it's not over. Maybe this challenge is actually going to move you closer. And then you think, well, maybe you're totally wrong about your interpretation of things. And as you talk about it, you're going to be embarrassed and humiliated. And then you notice the storytelling nature of your mind. You have a moment when you realize, I'm just hallucinating things that may not be real. So here you've just had a journey through what we call the aggregates. An aggregate is a collection. Sometimes it's described as a heap. Like here's just a heap of different functions. The first is form. Something happens. There's a material thing that occurs. What arises from the form of that material thing is feeling. The sensations arise from the impact of that experience of that form. Now, the sensations that arise in their most raw form show up in 3 different ways. There's going to be pleasant sensations that you like and want more of. There'll be unpleasant sensations you want to make go away or move away from. And there'll be neutral sensations. They're neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Now from here, there'll be perceptions, or what we can call interpretations. So if we go back to this example, here's this event, this conversation you've got to have. When you think about it, you've got all these sensations, the unpleasant, the pleasant, all this whole play. And then you start recognizing and labeling the components of that experience. Then you notice you'll move into mental activity, which is the formation of a story. These are all the mental imprints, the mental memories, the conditioning, the whole narrative that you lay onto your experience. And the fifth aggregate is consciousness. It's the discrimination, when you realize, whoa, I'm just telling myself a story here. Sort of like that discriminating quality of consciousness. So these are the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perceptions, mental activity, and then consciousness. Now, if we go back to this inevitable stress that we experience, that stress and dissatisfaction, unsteadiness occur when you cling to any one of these. If you cling to the feeling, if you cling to the story, if you cling to the perceptions, if you cling to your interpretation, if you cling to any of these, you will experience stress. As the great teacher Ajahn Chah said, if you hang on to the rope too tight, you get rope burn. And the corollary of that is stress is extinguished when you let go. When you let go, you're free. And when you look at this closer, any identification, any kind of story keeps you caught. And we live on this spectrum of being able to tolerate stress to not being able to tolerate it. I mentioned a few talks ago my good friend Peter, who described the different levels of pain that he experiences, and how the first level of pain he described is kind of like sort of generalized discomfort. When you're having a procedure done, your teeth cleaning, or maybe sutures removed, he has the ability to chat up the person, kind of be interested in the procedure. And the other end of that pain spectrum is his capacity to be the witness of that pain falls away. That's when the clenching starts, when he's digging his fingernails into his palms, or maybe even just screaming or laughing when the pain is so intense. The basic point is, it's so hard to retain our sense of equanimity in the face of pain. Stress, dissatisfaction, unsteadiness, and suffering happen in life. And again, it doesn't mean necessarily that anything is wrong. But of course, that's not how we interpret pain when it occurs. So here is this wound of pain. And we're all wounded in all different ways: physical, psychic, emotional, mental. How do we go about unveiling the potential gift in that pain? And in a broader sense, how do we transform a life or lifetimes dedicated to avoiding pain to unveiling the gift? Well, 3 words. Have tea with your demon. See what I did there? Were you counting the words? You may be familiar with a classic story of the yogini who's meditating deeply in her cave. 3 demons come into the cave, and they're whirling around, horrible sounds and images, just doing their best to freak her out. And she very quietly gets up and starts building a little fire. Well, she's so non-reactive, this really activates the demons, and they just crank it up. Horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. And very calmly, she gets a little tea kettle and puts it on the fire. And this just pushes the demons over the edge. And they throw everything they've got at her. Horrible images, sounds, you name it. And she puts out these teacups. The demons stop and they say, "What is going on? We are your 3 deepest wounds. We are your 3 worst nightmares. And here you are building a fire, putting a little tea kettle on, putting out these cups. What's going on?" And she says, "Well, you've been here before and you'll be here again. So in the meantime, what kind of tea would you like?" In many ways, that's the essence of the practice. The capacity to have tea with your demons, to have tea with your wounds, to get familiar with. Now, the caveat here, of course, it's very hard to do this when you're traumatized. And quite often we think, oh, well, I'll have tea with my demons, and we find we get flooded. We lose our capacity to be with. And just to say that it's skillful quite often when you feel like it's too much, back away, shift your attention. Sometimes it's best to do this when the conditions are right, or to be facilitated by someone who's really skilled. But it points to this distinction in Vipassana meditation or in insight meditation. One aspect of this practice is around calming and arriving. So here we use concentration and relaxation. You arrive, you arrive, you arrive. Mind wanders, you bring it back. Mind wanders, you bring it back. Huge benefit in that. Inevitably, what will arise in your experience is something that is between you and feeling happy, something undigested, something unfelt, but it's just below the surface. And the beauty of Vipassana or insight meditation is here, according to your own intuitive form of practice, you actually move your attention from the anchor, the breath or sound or feeling, to explore and investigate the experience itself. The practice of rain, to recognize what's here, ask if you can allow it, might not be able to, and then investigate it. And the investigation is somatic. You can investigate your thoughts, your beliefs. And the important N of this equation is to draw on loving awareness, to draw on compassion, empathy, and you may find that sense of compassion and empathy is the lubrication that allows you to let go. Another model, which is so powerful, the practice of cha, or C-H-O-D, articulated exquisitely by Tsultrume Allione. The translation of this practice is called feeding your demons. Highly, highly recommended if you want to explore another model for really investigating your wounds and exploring how you can transform your relationship to a wound. I'll share a kind of a brief story / example of this. I was on a retreat, deep in the middle of a retreat, and I started to feel some very, very familiar feelings. A sense of discomfort, a sense of protection, a sense of pushing away. And I elected to turn my attention from my anchor of breath to explore these feelings that were emerging. And again, it's below the line of awareness, so just sort of making room for them. And part of this whole protective quality, I realized, was in relationship with my mother. Kind of a troubled relationship with my mother. My mother was somewhat of a troubled person. And I always found myself in relationship with her as being very, very protective around her needs and her wants of me. In this practice of feeding your demons, you explore that felt sense that arises, and then you imagine that, and demon is energy. It's another description of energy. You imagine that energy manifested outside of you. What would it look like if it lived outside your body? And for me, it was just this shape that was had different colors and had an intensity. It was just sort of like this, blob of energy. And you sense what it's like to sit across from it. Again, outside your body, but to be in relationship with it. Now, classically, when you do this practice, and I know I'm going really, really fast here, classically, you'd have a chair across from you, and you actually move, and you take the chair of the demon, and then you speak as that energy to give you that real, it's like Gestalt work. It gives you a really profound sense of it. But of course, I'm sitting in meditation. So I asked the demon, 2 questions. And again, this is part of this practice. The first is, what do you want? And I imagine this demon taking the form of the demon. What do you want? And it's like, I want to control you. I want you to bow to my every need. I could just feel how reactive I was. The second question to ask the demon is, what do you need? Very different question. What do you need in order to feel more whole? And the demon said, I want your attention. I want all of your attention. Now, this is where the practice, as Tsultrume describes it, takes a different kind of form. And as it's Tibetan in its form, there's a visualization. And the visualization is you imagine your body turning into this golden nectar, and you feed the demon what it needs until it's satisfied. And so I imagined my whole body turning into a golden nectar, and what it needed was my attention, and I tried to feed the demon until it was satisfied. And it just took everything I had. I thought, what do I do now? You start over. And I started over, and again, it was the wanting to control, the wanting to have me just endlessly serve, and then the need was, it moved from I want your attention to I want to be with you. I did a number of rounds, and then at one point, when I asked the demon what it needed, the demon said, I need you to acknowledge I did the best I could. And then I offered that, and then there was this kind of a beautiful sense of release. Now, the interesting thing here is when you do this practice, this thing that you've been fighting, again, what the demon needs is something you don't want to give it, is you look for how the demon is an ally. How is the demon actually wanting to serve you? And I began to really sense how this demon that had been fighting my whole life actually cared deeply for me. That actually had all these wonderful components of love and care and protection, and really, truly acknowledging and loving me. As I sort of felt that shift from the ally, I just sort of sat with that, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a really, really long time, going way, way back in my history with my mother, of really getting kind of the pure love and my capacity to feel it. Now, what I found, or what I find, is that every wound we experience in some form is an ally. Sometimes as a protective guardian. Your anxiety, your hypervigilance, was trying to make you feel safe so that you can really sense what's most important to you. Maybe your anger, your perpetual anger, is a warrior kind of wanting to protect a very, very sensitive heart. Maybe that sense of fear is there to help, really serving you to help you feel safe. It's trying to send you an early warning system to be alert. And we could spend the rest of our time here exploring this unveiling of the gift, and maybe more in the feeding of demons. And maybe we should, but I'm just going to offer kind of a brief review here. You might want to close your eyes just for a moment. And you might think of one of those 3 stressors in your life. And just pick one. You might take a moment just to kind of sense how that lives on the inside, how that issue lives in your tissues. And can you sense, what is your deepest fear here? What is your deepest anxiety? And again, we're not going to do a deep reflection here because of time. But you might just simply ask, is there a sense of that energy inside? Is there a sense how that in some way might be an ally, in some way wanting to serve you? Is there some message that it has for you? Something it needs? And if that need was satisfied, what would that feel like? What would that be like inside? So if you like, you can deepen your breath, and I'll include in the show notes some links you might follow up if you'd like to explore more. And perhaps if there's interest, I can do a full talk and kind of a guidance through this. But Tsultrume's work is beautiful. So the people that I find most interesting are people who have moved through their stress and their suffering and their wounds. The people who've had the courage to turn toward their pain and transform their relationship to it. And inevitably, when we can really have tea with our demons, when we get familiar with those very, very deep wounds, inevitably there's a sense of greater wisdom and greater compassion. I mentioned before this kintsugi, the philosophy of and the art form in late 16th and early 17th century Japan, taking broken pottery, reassembling it with glue and with gold. And in this, it's beautiful, beautiful stuff. There's no hiding the break. It's highlighted and celebrated. And the result is that the pottery is even stronger than it was before. And it's celebrating the spirit of healing and endurance. And I think there's something really powerful about this, of how our wounds can make us stronger and wiser and more compassionate. And if we elect not to hide our wounds, but bring them into the light of awareness, it's not only personal liberation, but it's freeing yourself in relationship with others. When you can free yourself from whatever holds you back, whatever's between you and feeling free, your life will transform internally. But the impact is even greater when you bring those gifts of your inner world into the relational world. And this leads to this whole concept of the wounded healer. I ran across this story which really touched me. There's a teacher by the name of Rob Bell. He was talking with a group, and a woman asked this question. She said, "What do you say to somebody whose young daughter has just died from a mysterious illness that only a few people get? What do you say to me? Because I just lost my daughter." Rob's response, he said, "Well, I said, first off, in the ancient wisdom tradition, in some suffering, there are no words. There's only silence. So I would begin with that if anyone who does give you a nice, clear-cut answer for why your daughter died, I don't know. But secondly, I do know this. At some point down the road, you're going to meet up with a woman who has also lost her young daughter. And you're going to look at her in the eyes and you're going to say, 'Me too.' And in that moment, you'll be standing on holy ground. Solidarity is divine when someone stands with you. And then here's what happens. The woman next to her starts weeping and says, 'My young daughter is really sick. And it only given her a little bit of time to live.' And this woman turns to her. Through our wounds, it opens up our capacity to connect, to be present for others. I think I shared the story recently, but there's a story of a young Dharma teacher, bright person, young person who was doing a teacher training and working with one of the senior Dharma teachers in the country. And she said, I've read the whole reading list. I've done the retreats you recommended. What do I need to do to become a better Dharma teacher? And the response from this teacher, he said, you need to suffer more. Don't worry, it'll come. I love that response. It's the suffering that breaks down our barriers. And when we can embrace the breaks and the wounds, when we can bring them forward, when we can share the radiance of our discoveries with each other. If you think of a wound in your life, something that you've actively worked with, maybe you're on the other side of it. Maybe a betrayal or a breakup in a relationship or moving through a chronic illness. You might take a moment, and again, if you like, you can close your eyes. Think of a wound in your life. And imagine now meeting someone who is in the middle of that same thing right now, utterly caught. What is your inner response? What does it feel like inside as you just imagine being with this person who is in the middle of what you have gone through? Can you sense that holy ground that you share? If you like, you can open your eyes. Andrew Harvey, incredible author, he said years ago that we are moving from an age of gurus to an age of wounded healers. Moving from an age of gurus to an age of wounded healers. The guru being the exalted head of any organization. And it's an amazing thing to reflect on. And when you think about the dissolution of ashrams, the dissolution of formal churches that's going on, the arising of 12-step, the arising of peer groups. In the community itself, when we are all wounded healers, we acknowledge our imperfections. We are transparent about our imperfections. We kind of embrace the concept of kintsugi. And we acknowledge as well the wisdom that arises from our struggles. And when we bring that into relationship with those who are struggling, it becomes holy ground. And this is the framework of the wounded healer. It changes your relationship to life, and it opens the door to so much, the potential of so much more ease and freedom. So it opens up this whole question of reframing our relationship to pain. You know, there's such a vastly intelligent universe. I've shared this before, that this intelligent universe is so intelligent that it is this intimately customized feedback loop that lets you know when you're out of balance. Of course, it's called pain. This early warning detection system. And the question is, can we actually embrace pain as being vastly intelligent? Can we embrace pain as this voice that's calling for attention? Of course, we're aware of the peril to avoiding that voice. If you get mild signals and you avoid them, the mild signals become more alarming. You know, we have sort of like the little zaps of pain that are there to help us self-correct. If we ignore those, they simply get stronger and stronger and stronger. But the question becomes, those sacred wounds, how are they connected to your gifts? I'd like to share a little reading, which I find really powerful. So if you'd like, you can close your eyes. I'd like to do a little review. We covered a lot of ground here. First, we talked about how stress has to do with clinging. Stress is unavoidable in life. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong. Reflecting on the aggregates. First is form. Something happens. What arises from form is feeling. Sensations that arise on the inside, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. What arises from that experience are the interpretations, kind of the recognition of what's arising, the labeling. What arises from perception is the mental activity, the story, the narrative. What arises from the story is kind of the cognizance, the discrimination, the recognition of this. And any one of these, whatever you hold on to, will result in some form of stress or dissatisfaction. Whatever you can release or let go of opens up a level of spaciousness, a sense of I and mine falling away. As you liberate yourself, you open into an intimate relationship with the world. Reflecting on the following words. This is entitled, I Am a Wounded Healer. Through my brokenness, I see your own. Through the fissures in my soul, I see your own. The pain that lives deep in my chest makes me attuned to the melody of hearts that cry as mine does. My words, my voice, and my heart will hold you as love pours out of me into you. Until your tears subside, until your legs are ready to hold your weight, I will stay in this space with you because I know how it feels to be alone. I know how it feels to need to be held while tears fall uncontrollably. I see you as you are, wounded and beautiful as I am too. In these final minutes, I'd like to offer 2 reflections for you to reflect on. Quite often there is something searing in our life, some wound that creates a sense of separation, a sense that there is something wrong. And you might reflect, how might the deepest wounds in your life be intimately connected to or might flower into your greatest gift to the world? And a second reflection. You might think of those 3 current stressors in your life and just select one challenge in your life right now. Is there a sense how this current challenge might open the possibility of new possibilities into developing some form of mastery, some form of skillfulness? What might be the lesson or the invitation in this challenge? So you might very gently deepen your breath. You might let your body move and stretch in any way that feels good. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Covered a lot of ground. I will share some of these links because there's so much to explore around the possibility of transformation. To sense how that which you have perceived as something holding you back can actually be the lens through which, in transformation, you might develop some beautiful gifts in the world. And chances are, as one teacher points out, when you look at what you do best in the world, you may find that it is related to that wound. Quite often when we have that sense when we're young that no one gets you or you're on your own, you develop a strategy for self-protection. And that strategy eventually turns into something you're really good at. If no one was there for you, you might get really, really good at being there for others. If you grew up in a really, really chaotic house, you might have a real capacity for intuition. Or maybe you're an organizer. Maybe you know how to make things happen in relationship to that feeling of lack in your life. It's all about the awakening of heart and mind. And I wish you so well in your practice and in your journey. Thank you again for your time and attention, and happy trails.